Everyone, and welcome to the session on distributed energy. So do we have viable opportunities in wholesale markets yet, right? So before we get into it up here, I'd like to remind you all to log into gtm.cnf.io and ask all of your burning questions during our panel. So I'll try to take those throughout and see what happens there. Now, before we start our conversation, I'd like to give kind of a brief overview of what we mean when we talk about distributed energy resources participating in markets, right? Now, when we talk about DERs, we're essentially talking about quite a wide range of assets that are located on different parts of the distribution grid, both in front of the meter and behind the meter, that are providing flexibility. Now, this can be in distribution utility grid services programs, but they've also found economic opportunity in independent system operator and regional transmission organization wholesale markets. And this is mainly driven by energy and capacity prices. Now, when we look at DERs, we're essentially talking about them participating in markets through demand response mechanisms, right? And when we look at the amount of flexibility that we have in the wholesale market footprints today, we're looking at about 31 gigawatts of flexibility that we have. Now, the availability of these resources has been impacted by several big developments in 2016 and 2017. So I'd briefly like to highlight a few of those, right? So we started off in 2016, as it was mentioned earlier today, with the Supreme Court upholding FERC Order 745. And essentially, we legalized the participation of demand response in wholesale markets. So that was a big win starting last year. By the middle of 2016, Environmental Protection Agency regulations went into effect, essentially putting limitations on fossil-based backup generators that can participate in emergency demand response programs. Now, non-emission compliant generators couldn't participate as of May of 2016, and that essentially took out about 2 gigawatts of capacity from the market. Now, slowly, that capacity has been retrofitted, and it's starting to come back into the market, but we may not see it all come back, right? The California Public Utilities Commission at the end of last year said that in California, any fossil-based backup generators, doesn't matter if they're emission compliant or not, cannot participate in emergency demand response. And California has kind of led the way in several developments last year and this year. I think one of the most noteworthy market developments was with its revision to its open access transmission tariff, which essentially stated that distribution connected resources can be aggregated and can participate in energy and ancillary services. And as of right now, you have 4 distributed energy resource providers that can bring that flexibility to market. California, in the last 2 years, has also proven through its demand response auction mechanism pilot that you can procure flexibility through a competitive solicitation. In the last auction that was held, more than 200 megawatts of capacity was procured. And as of last week, the demand response auction mechanism pilot will continue past 2018. So we're not just piloting it, it's continuing. And of course, we can't mention flexibility without mentioning the NOPR for storage, right? And although the main focus is on storage, more broadly speaking, we are talking about how various distributed energy resources can participate in markets and how these markets can become more accommodating. So I always kind of like to ground this conversation, right? When we're talking about distributed energy resources, they're participating in regulation, in reserves, in energy and capacity programs. And I'm giving the example here of PJM, right? This is a nearly $660 million market a year. But sometimes we kind of have this mindset when we talk about DERs, and we think about this in a futuristic world where we have electric vehicles and battery storage and smart thermostats. And these are resources that do provide demand response, and they do provide flexibility, but they are not at scale right now, right? When we look at PJM, you're looking at the majority of the market being manufacturing, HVAC, backup generators with electric water heaters, and batteries having found a sweet spot in regulation. Why are we having this conversation today about DERs participating in wholesale markets? Well, actually, it's been quite a buzzworthy year, not just because of the NOPR, but increasingly so this year because of the NOPR on storage and DERs in general. System operators have commissioned studies looking at the implications of deeper penetration levels of these resources, both in their markets and in their power systems. So I have a great panel here with me to continue the discussion. So I'd like to ask each of them to give a brief introduction and tell us a little bit, what is their stake in bringing distributed energy resources to market. So Mia, let's start with you.
Yeah, thank you for having me here today. My name is Mia Adams. I'm with MISO. At MISO, I serve as the Senior Manager of Market Strategy. It's a new role that was created about 2 years ago, and what I work with is prioritizing and portfolio management for market enhancements. And this does include a focus on newer technologies, newer capabilities or characteristics that we may want to explicitly value, and partnering with our R&D team and other functions across the organization, internally as well as externally, to help understand what's driving those things forward, and how we can best resource various efforts and various market enhancements.
Great. Tim.
Hi, my name is Tim Carter. I work with a company called MP2 Energy. We're a retail electric provider based out of the Woodlands, Texas, which is just north of Houston. We also act as an asset manager, or in ERCOT language, a QSE, for about 1,500 megawatts of power plants. And we also have a relatively large demand response portfolio. That portfolio consists of traditional load curtailment, but also more customized resources include, backup generation, wireless thermostats, et cetera. I also am the chairman of the demand side working group here at ERCOT, so I work on, enhancing the rules for demand response participation in the ERCOT market.
Great. Phil.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Phil Mihlmester. I run the global energy practice at ICF. We're a consulting firm, so we have a market operator, a market participant, and a market consultant.
Trifecta.
So you got trifecta. We advise utilities and other stakeholders on all of these related issues. So, for example, we're working with the joint utilities on the New York REV, trying to come up with their filings in response to the New York REV process, working with the California utilities on their filings, working with utilities in unstructured markets, trying to figure out how DER and DR fits into their planning operations. So I'm looking forward to the conversation, and thanks for having me.
Great. So I'd actually like to kick off our conversation here talking about reliability. It's something that has been brought up in almost every panel. And demand response is one of those resources, at least when it's procured as an emergency resource, that kind of sits idle. But actually, this past spring, the California ISO nearly called half of its capacity for an emergency event, first event in nearly 10 years. And in the MISO territory, you had the first event in 10 years as well. So can you tell us a little bit about what the value is of having demand response as a reliability asset? So Mia, maybe kick us off here.
Yeah, absolutely. So just a quick overview, too, of how demand response can participate in the MISO market. We have kind of three basic spheres, but there is overlap between them. There's demand response type 1, which can aggregate up to a minimum of a megawatt across a LBA zone. That could be things like water heaters. Usually it's an on-off switch. Those can participate in an emergency situation, or they can also participate a little bit more broadly. Demand response resources type 2, that usually has the ability to ramp a little bit. That can participate in all our markets, capacity, energy, ancillary services, and our ramp capability product. And so that's very helpful, I think, on a regular basis from a reliability and flexibility standpoint. And then the third category would be the load modifying resources, which include demand response as well as behind the meter generation. And those have some flexibility too, depending on, there's a lot of caveats to all the rules. But those are often most frequently called upon in emergency situations. And then there's the emergency demand response category, which also is for emergencies. And those are, I think, very important assets in being able to handle emergency events and curtail load effectively in a way that we have, you can kind of count on them to follow the dispatch instructions, I think is the key thing. We want to make sure that when we have a resource that has committed that they're there, that we can count on them when we need them. And so I think that is something to stress, kind of. And we do have penalties, so if they don't respond effectively, they get penalized for that. And I think that's an important part of the design.
Well, in ERCOT, we really have two broad categories of demand response that have frankly proven their value repeatedly. Our first one, load resources, is a somewhat unique demand response product. The customer needs to be able to do two things. They either need to be able to respond within 10 minutes, drop their load to their obligated amount within 10 minutes, or they also have to be able to respond instantaneously to frequency. So they have an under frequency relay. System frequency gets to 59.7 hertz, and they, for 20 cycles or a third of a second, they'll instantly drop their load. And that's really an important aspect of our reliability mix here in ERCOT with the small grid that we do have. Secondly, after the rolling outages we had in 2007, the PUC created another program, Emergency Response Service. That's only been called 3 times, but it's been very important when it's called. In fact, we recently had a PUCT rulemaking on that product to verify that it was still worthwhile, and it was, I think, pretty soundly and roundly, convincingly argued that it was a very valuable product to ERCOT for the reliability needs.
Great. And Phil, as a market consultant, how important is this conversation of reliability when you're talking about increased activity at the distribution level, where currently system operators actually have very low visibility?
Yeah, Elton, I think that is obviously a key issue that we're seeing. And in our work, this is in real time being argued and discussed and worked through with the ISOs and the various stakeholder groups and committees that have been formed. And I think there's lots of issues and lots of variability that we're seeing. I think New York is certainly on the bleeding edge a little bit, maybe, and trying to push dual participation and full opportunity to realize everything in the value stack, much akin to the federal NOPR. Some of the other jurisdictions are, I think, a little behind that, still struggling. PJM seems to be, saying one or the other, either distribution or wholesale, but we don't want to double count. And so I think there's a lot of issues around this, and then around how the whole mechanisms of market settlement and double counting and all these things work themselves through. So I think we're in the thick of this debate, and just in the last 35 days, there's been several working papers put out there by several of the ISOs on these topics, and some are espousing straw proposals, like in the case, I think, of New York or PJM, I can't remember which, and some are saying we're going to work on it, it's coming, but we haven't gotten there yet.
Mia, I know that MISO recently was in the process of finishing up a study on DERs in your territory. Why is now the time to have that conversation in MISO?
Well, I think there's a few drivers for that. One is the pace of technology change. I think there's different barriers. There's new types, so it's not just a giant plant that can curtail, its production and look at that arbitrage opportunity. There's a lot more ways to participate now than maybe have been common historically. So there's a new set of, interested stakeholder groups in a way. I don't know if that might make it too big. But either way, there's a lot of interest in what does this mean to us and how can we participate? How can we optimize the use of our assets? How do we plan for the future for investments? Obviously, demand response can be an integral way of maintaining and managing reliability. How do we leverage a lot of these new technologies to counterbalance some of the dynamic elements of the renewable fleet, et cetera, and the resource evolution? And so I think that's got people wondering. There's not necessarily clear, singular technology winners. It's more fragmented. And so we're definitely in a phase of, we have a long list of questions, and we're trying to work through them, prioritize them, collaborate with our state policymakers and other, our member organizations and variety of folks to figure out, what does that path forward look like?
Yeah, I'm going to pick on you just a little bit more because I know that there is a lot more demand response in your territory than is actually being utilized. I know we spoke a little bit about Great River Energy. They have electric water heaters that they use as a grid resource all the time, and why is that not participating in MISO?
So I can't talk about particular market participants or member companies in the ISO. There are, so as I mentioned before, kind of some of the key groups. So water heaters would fall into that demand response 1 group. Mm-hmm. So they can aggregate, they have to meet a minimum threshold of 1 megawatt within LBA. We do have on the other side, if you want to go smaller, the LMR, the load modifying resource, which can be demand response or behind the meter generation. That has a minimum threshold of 100 kilowatts within an LBA zone. And so sometimes it depends on how spread out a company's customer base might be. In more rural areas, to get to that minimum number, they may be, more spread out than 1 LBA. So that could be a barrier to participation. And there is some rationale behind that because, sometimes you want a resource so that you can manage congestion. And if it's coming from across, let's say, a whole entire state, like the state of Wisconsin or the state of Illinois, it's really hard to effectively use that to manage congestion. You may actually end up hurting the problem more than helping it.
Yep. And Tim, I know we had a little bit of a conversation on this, the whole measurement and verification, the telemetry for demand response. Can you just enlighten us a little bit on this in ERCOT?
Yeah, so I think we really have 2 different standards within ERCOT. Our load resources are modeled on the network model, much like a generation resource, and as such, those assets are required to have 2-second telemetry. When we look at fast frequency responding storage assets, however, those have to have 2-second telemetry, but also recording down to 32 times a second. Our ERS, or Emergency Response Service assets, do not require any telemetry, but they do require an interval type of meter, which of course we've got a pretty wide adoption of smart meters, so that's really not a problem. One of the things that we have kicked around, well, we actually do have a resource type, a load resource that provides non-spin. It exists, no one's really using it, but it would be as an aggregated load resource. Those resources are not required to have individual telemetry, but rather, at certain larger points. And I think that's probably, as we look at other resource types, we'll try and determine what the appropriate telemetry requirements are, what ERCOT needs for reliability, but also recognizing the economic reality. Now, I probably shouldn't tip my hand with the ERCOT folks in the room, but technologies come down quite a bit, and communications is relatively cheap. So, providing granular level of detail is really generally not that problematic unless we're talking extremely small resources.
And is that a cost that lies with ERCOT, or is it a cost that should lie with the entity providing?
Oh, it's definitely the responsibility of the entity providing the resource, and should be. Right.
Great. Now, Phil, I know we talked a lot about this distribution market that we're all dreaming of. So what does it take to actually bring that market to reality and have it actually interact with a bulk power system?
So I think, let me just suggest what we're part of the More Than Smart Collaborative in California. You cited their staff report that they came out with in June. And it just goes to show you that they're modeling three scenarios. They're modeling DERs that interconnect directly with the wholesale market and not the retail market. Then they're modeling DERs that connect with the distribution provider and not the wholesale market, okay? And then their third scenario is this combination, and they're gonna try to figure that out. So far, they're on step one. And they're still working just the wholesale interconnections. They haven't even gotten to the distribution part or the integrated set. But I think what we're seeing is in the distribution part of the equation, it's all about time and location.
Yep.
Location, time. And it's kind of turning a little bit of, and it's sort of doing the net value stack across those dimensions. And so it's kind of turning a little conventional thinking a little bit on its head. We're one of the largest energy efficiency program operators. We do energy efficiency programs for 40 utilities. And what we're seeing is that you could get into situations on the distribution side where certain DERs are fighting against energy efficiency. You're making the problem worse. And so we're going to have to get a lot more complex in deducing out the value stack for where these DERs go and when they contribute or inject or don't or consume, and then how that values out, and then how that interfaces with wholesale operations. You know? And so I think these things are really in the throes of all being sort of thought through.
Great. Tim, I know we've talked a little bit about aggregations. Are they a reality for actually providing services to the ISO, or are we just looking, one resource has, one purpose?
Well, right now our emergency response service allows for aggregations. So, our minimum size is 100 kW for a resource, but a resource can be comprised of many sites, and it's an ERCOT-wide resource as well, so it doesn't have to be constrained to a certain area. So we do have that. One of the things that I would, it's kind of on my wish list to develop at ERCOT is an aggregated load resource that's providing, the responsive reserve, so therefore frequency responsive. That again, today we would model like a generator at a certain point on the map, but I'd like to see resources provide that on a broader scale. It'll be interesting. Every once in a while you'll hear about appliances or what have you that are supposedly coming out that will be frequency responsive. If in fact those are, it could be a very worthwhile resource in a coordinated fashion. We've had upwards to, over 10 megawatts of wireless thermostats, pretty easily within our own portfolio, and significantly more megawatts than that participating. So it's certainly an achievable and doable resource.
Great. And actually, this is a great segue into our next question for all you guys. And Phil, I'm going to start with you because it's a distribution connected question. Residential customers participating in demand response, is that a reality at scale?
Well, I would defer to Tim on that, there are examples of significant, retail participation in DR programs, and we've seen that in a number of states that we're working with, and I think a number of utilities are driving that for a variety of reasons. In some cases, distribution deferral. In some cases, reliability. In some cases, because their regulators are telling them to do it. So I think there's smart thermostats are coming into the fore in terms of delivery of those kinds of programs as well. So yeah, I think there's no inherent barrier to significant residential participation in demand response.
Right. Yeah, and I'm aware of companies, providing, home-level generators, for example, to provide demand response. So, there's a lot of potential, I think.
Yeah, Emmy, I'm going to ask you this question that's coming in from our audience. In your opinion, distributed energy resources, do they offset transmission costs on the non-wires alternatives or supplement the energy mix? Can you use demand response as a non-wires alternative that's viable long-term instead of building out new transmission, let's say?
I think it depends on the magnitude of what you're, on both sides of the equation, what it is. I think that we are definitely seeing interest in being able to pursue those types of opportunities. That is a topic that comes up in our stakeholder discussions. And those are things that we're trying to understand how to model better.
Great. And I think we're a little bit past our time here, so I'm going to ask each of you to give us a little bit of your food for thought. Where should these distributed energy resources be going in 2018?
Well, I think for those of us who are keeping it short, for those of us who are interested in DERs and how they evolve into the marketplace, we have to become involved in the ISO stakeholder meetings and really start thinking through all of these myriad of issues that have been defined about how these things get compensated and incented.
Yeah, perfect segue for me. Demand Side Working Group is meeting on Friday the 17th, where we're going to focus on non-wires alternatives. So, that might be a first real foray in that discussion at ERCOT. We'll see where that goes.
Great. Last thoughts?
Yeah, I think that going forward, it's really trying to understand our goals are trying to be open access, technology agnostic. So we don't necessarily have, something to promote. We're not trying to promote one technology over another, but in order to be fair, you need to understand what are those capabilities, what are the characteristics, and how do you explicitly value what needs to be valued appropriately, and what is the technology that it takes to do that. So I think for MISO, one of the biggest efforts that we're doing that could be a major enabler is an investment in a new market management system, starting from clean code, so not necessarily, based on our legacy market management system. And I think that, some of the goals there are to have a modular, flexible architecture so that we can enable, our role to help states achieve, their goals and provide that regional facilitation to optimize value creation for the footprint.
Yep. So there it is, folks, more technology. All right, thank you to our panelists. Please find them and continue the conversation later on. So stay tuned for our next panel.